plug or two around here
I
somewhere.
ran into Steve McMillan last night when I was talking to my car.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, he was walking to the.
There's Mark. There's Mark back there.
He said.
There's Steve right there, actually.
He said he's coming to Notre Dame this fall for a conference.
Oh, Steve is?
He was like, yeah, I signed up for a conference. I didn't pay attention to where it was. Sure enough, it's in Notre Dame, so we'll have to grab dinner.
That'd be great.
Do you have a microphone and a wireless?
Yeah, they're gonna give me a. Hi. I am ready to go. Yeah, I enjoyed your speech last night.
You see me slip out. I just have to do a short radio interview from the
Yeah.
piano practice room upstairs.
Okay, I will. I will know that
Hope
you're
you
not
know I'm
walking out in
running
disgust.
From whatever you said, 'cause this is actually of more interest to me than. I mean, I just sort of think that one of the most helpful things is how we have this capacity to rewire ourselves for empathy to address this. I think that's people are like, oh, there's nothing we can do. Actually, we're fully capable of changing ourselves, how we think about things, the stories that we live by. Faster than we actually could imagine. So I think it's all about the work of the heart.
Wonderful.
A combination of it. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Anyway, look forward to your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm
taking notes.
glad to have your comments afterward.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Chuck.
And this is my wife, Janelle.
Hi, Janelle. Pleased
Janelle.
to meet you. Chuck Collins.
So chicken find a walking. Chicken find to come. Chicken find a walking.
Wonderful. I mean, fun is employee of the college too. I guess she doesn't have classes off.
She usually doesn't work. Well, I don't think she starts at like 9. Thank you.
I like you too. I think you're cute. You can stand up and cheer at the end. Oh, yeah. Be my plant.
Oh, the crowd's lead on that one.
Be my plant.
Good to see you.
Good to see you, Jason. How you doing, man?
Yeah. He needs to come from like the middle of the crowd.
Middle front, right? That's
You need me to, like, not the front. You need to be
they need about like 4 or 5 rows back. Right?
like, you need to come to like
Yep. You gotta know anybody there?
you're doing a good job of being front most, center most.
Yeah.
You give them the time.
I don't know any of them though. Oh, Sarah's front. Sarah's front and center. I can get Sarah to stand up and cheer. She's sitting in
there are a number of empty seats on this side, so if I could maybe encourage those who are coming in to come up to the front. Well, good morning. Good morning, Hope College.
Good morning.
I know we're not in the classroom and we're a little bit subdued, but this is really a moment of celebration of what we might be able to do together with respect to this topic of economic inequality. Just a couple of things before we move on. My name is Alfredo Gonzalez, and along with Derek Emerson and the members of the CIS Planning Committee, we want to thank you for your participation on the program that we have prepared for you. When you look at our website and you find the names of those members of our committee, please take an opportunity to thank them for the work that they've done for the past several months. They have been just a terrific group of colleagues to work with, and I'm just so grateful to them. Just want to call a couple of things to your attention. Following the keynote address this morning, we will then adjourn to the NIC. We want to take this conversation from the national level to what is taking place in our own community. So we're going to look at economic inequality here in Holland. And so you will see listed in the program a number of those speakers that will take place. So when we're done, please make your way over to the NIC and be part of that conversation. For lunch, you are on your own, except I want to extend a very personal invitation for you to join us at a luncheon with Nick Galasso. Nick Galasso is with Oxfam. He is a scholar of the poverty, the politics of poverty. He's also a Woodrow Wilson scholar, and we're going to have an informal lunch over in the Moss Conference Room. Go through the line, pick up a lunch. If you're not on a meal plan, do not worry. We have a sign-up sheet where you can sign on to that list and then just grab your lunch and then quickly move over to the Moss Auditorium. Then I commend you to the 1 p.m. focus sessions. They're all over our campus, so I ask you to make your way there. And then at 2:30, we will have departmental sessions. Your departments have invited scholars to take part on this conversation from a variety of perspectives, from art to history to economics. Come and be part of those conversations. And at the very end, at 4 o'clock, if you're still standing, which I hope you are, come to a community conversation sponsored by GROW. And that will be also in the conference room. And when we are done with the Day of Critical Issues, our work really will begin. Our hope will be that you will find a way in which we, as individuals, perhaps also as a community, can find ways to do something to make better a life for everybody else, all right? So now it is my pleasure to introduce our provost, Karen Nordell Pearson, who will introduce our speaker.
Good morning again, and thank you all for being here. A special warm welcome to our guests from the community, and an especially warm welcome to those of you that are presenters. As Alfredo just mentioned, we've got an absolutely packed day, and I really hope you take this opportunity to go to as many sessions as possible. Thank you to each of our presenters for joining our community today and bringing your wisdom, your experience, and your knowledge to us on this very important topic. If you were with us last night, and please, those of you, just come on in and find a seat. Don't be shy. If you were with us last night, you heard President Knapp say that this year's CIS started on Monday night with the first presidential debate. I will suggest that it actually started for me, and perhaps for some of you, the day before. On Sunday, in many of our churches, if your church follows the lectionary, when we had the New Testament passage from Luke chapter 16. This familiar passage describes a very rich man living in luxury and a beggar who sits outside his gate, desperate for the crumbs off that man's table. Both of them die, and we're told of a conversation of sorts between the rich man, who is now in torment, and the beggar, who is now up in heaven. Thinking ahead to our symposium this week, I was struck with the passage's description of deep inequality, and even more troubling, the lack of human connection, compassion, and justice between the rich man and the beggar at his gate. This morning's speaker, Dr. David Phillips, is going to invite us to consider inequality with both our hearts and our brains. David Phillips, who worked here at Hope in the Department of Economics and Business for 4 years, just started as a research assistant professor for the Wilson Sheehan Lab for Economic Opportunities at the University of Notre Dame. David's research as a part of this lab is aimed at finding innovative, effective, and scalable programs that help people move out of poverty. We miss you here at Hope, David, but we're really excited for you as this opportunity allows you to use your gifts, which are significant, and your passion, both your head and your heart, to thoughtfully address the challenging issues of poverty. Please help me welcome Dr. David Phillips for our morning address.
Thank you so much, Karen. So thank you, everyone, for the wonderful welcome back to Hope College. Thank you to Karen, especially for the kind introduction, to Alfredo, the entire committee. I also miss all of you, and it's so wonderful to be back here at Hope. I'm grateful especially, too, to all of the students who came this morning, because I know that this is a 9 a.m. lecture, right? And there are alternatives to being here. You don't have class. You could be catching up on studying, of course, very likely. Or, more likely, right, you could be doing that major alternative activity for all students, right? You could be sleeping right now, and yet you are here, and so I'm very grateful for that. I'm going to start this speech with just a couple introductory notes. So first, you should know where I'm coming from on this. I'm going to speak about inequality from the point of view of someone who's always been, well, at least for the most part, been in the top half of the income distribution. My father's a doctor. I'm a college professor. I've never been anywhere close to the top 1% of income earners. But other than a couple years of grad school, I've always sort of been in the top half and usually somewhere above that. Some of you in this crowd will be coming at this issue from a totally different angle, right? You will have very different experience from me. And I just want to say at this point that if I leave out your interaction with this issue, forgive me for that, because I think today I'm going to be of most use speaking out of my own experience and exhorting people who have experienced the world similarly to me to think more deeply and clearly about inequality. The second thing I'd like to say to start off is that I find it a little bit odd to be speaking at Hope College right now as a CIS Keynote speaker, right? In January, I was an employee of Hope College, and I was even on the CIS committee. I did not pick myself to speak, but I was on the committee a few months ago. And so I'm mindful that many of you know me much better than a typical speaker at one of these events, which means that when I get to how to apply all of this, you're going to have no starry-eyed ideas that I actually embody fully all of the things I'm going to tell you today. But I hope our pre-existing relationship also allows me to challenge you. I'm going to have a big goal today. See, right, the title up on the screen, right, says that we're going to be talking about following our hearts or our brains, and I'm going to make an argument that we need fundamentally both. We need to follow both our hearts and our brains when dealing with inequality. By taking an hour of your time to talk about that, it must mean that I think that we're missing that mark somehow, that we're not quite getting there. So, Hope College, it's great to be back. I'm going to proceed to call everyone either brainless or heartless, and then we'll sort of move from there. right? But seriously, let's do 3 things today. I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the beginning talking about how inequality has increased over the past several years. The keynote last night spent a lot of time on this, so I'm going to spend not quite as much, but I know that not everybody goes to every event of critical issue symposium, so I'll spend a little bit of time on that. Second, I'm going to argue why rising inequality should trigger a heart response in us. That we can't ignore inequality as unimportant without ignoring our own sort of natural common sense and moral compass within us. And then finally, I'm going to argue that that heartfelt response is not quite enough. It's important, it's fundamental, but it's not quite enough. That if we respond only with our hearts, only with moral outrage, we may very well make the situation worse. We can move toward a more equitable democracy, but it will take accessing that other part of our abilities, our minds. We're in trouble if we omit either our heart or our brain. So, get a drink of water. For the students out there, I'm actually not that much older than you. I probably seem a lot older because I'm up on stage and wearing a suit, and I was a professor here. But I was born in 1985, probably about 10 years after most of the students that are in the room, and maybe that seems like a long time, but in the grand scheme of the world economy, 10 years should be really short, right? We sit here today and we think about 1785 and 1795, and those don't seem very different to us, right? Similarly, you would think that the 10 years of time that passed between when I was born and when most of the students here were born shouldn't be that big of a deal in the world economy. But the world that you were born into is actually quite different than the one I was born into as a baby. So this is I'm an economist. I have to show you at least one graph in the presentation, or I'm not doing my job as an economist. So here's a graph from researchers Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty. And what I'm going to focus on is the black line. I think this is the only graph for the presentation. You can be glad to hear that. The black line is showing what fraction of income has gone to the top 1% of income earners over time in the United States. So the richest 1% of people, how much of total income in the US do they receive? And you can see that back in the 1920s, during the Gilded Age, right? So this is during the time of, if you read the book, The Great Gatsby, when you were a kid in high school and you read it and it made no sense to you, right? And you should read it now. The older you are, the more that novel makes sense. But this time when, like the title character in Gatsby, people were accumulating incredibly large fortunes and inequality in the United States was high, that's the left side of the graph, where that black line is high, where 20%, 1 out of every $5 was going to the top 10%. What you'll notice is that then, as you move along this graph, it starts falling, right? In the mid-20th century, post-World War II, 50s, 60s, early 70s, that dropped considerably. We moved from a situation where 1 out of every $5 was going to this richest group to where only 1 in $10 was going to that richest group. That measure of inequality fell by half. We had this period of relative equality that went right up until about the time that I was born, mid-early 80s. Over the past 30, 40 years, you can see as you look at that graph, we've sort of returned to the Gilded Age. Income shares of the top 1% have returned to the levels of the 1920s. We're back in an era of high inequality, where 1 out of every $5 is going to this top 1%. It's important to note that there's broad agreement about this general fact. There's a lot of other facts that are debated and bounced back and forth, but this general idea that inequality has increased is relatively uncontroversial. There are points to quibble about. These exact numbers on the screen depend a little bit about whether you think people, these are all from taxable income. So if you think the rich have changed their tendency to try to avoid taxes over time or things like this, then these numbers can change a little bit. But a wide range of economists of different political stripes agree on this fundamental statement of fact that inequality has increased. So the research I mentioned before came from a couple of more sort of left-leaning economists, Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty, so it's probably useful for me at this point to quote a more conservative economist, Greg Mankiw, who some of you will know as a textbook author. Others will know as someone who advised President George W. Bush, advised Mitt Romney's campaign, and so on. So Mankiw says this: since the 1970s, average incomes have grown, but the growth has not been uniform across the income distribution. The incomes at the top, especially in the top 1%, have grown much faster than average. The question for public policy is what, if anything, to do about it. Those who are familiar with Greg Mankiw will know that he goes on to argue why we should not be concerned about inequality. I'm going to be arguing the other side today. You should read his argument. But we agree on the situation. Inequality has increased. There's somewhat greater debate about why inequality has changed over time, but in the past several years, I would say that most economists have identified a central theme, that the world has changed rapidly, leaving behind those with more limited education or formal skills, that this is a big driver of this type of picture. And I think of this change, I personally think of this change as a story of Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel. Small children tend to latch on particular books, and they want them to be read over and over and over and over and over again. You can tell now that I have a 2-year-old son, right? So, my son's current favorites: The Little Blue Truck, 100 Trucks, completely pandering to little boys, Where Do Diggers Sleep at Night? Those are his favorite books. My favorite book when I was a preschool boy was Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel. You can tell the father and son similarities. Mike Mulligan tells a story of this proud equipment operator, Mike, and his steam shovel, Marianne. The scene is set as they build skyscrapers and airports and interstate highways. They build something that looks kind of like the Panama Canal at one point in the book. They're on top of the world. But then the world changes. People invent new, better, gasoline-powered steam shovels. And the new equipment starts getting the big fancy jobs. Steam shovels are worth more as scrap now than as construction equipment. Poor Mike looks at his anthropomorphized steam shovel Marianne sitting next to this scrapyard and contemplates what to do with her. And preschool David is really, really concerned about Marianne, right? Oh no, Marianne. This is an old story, right? The world changes. People with skills and training fit to the old world can't keep up and fall behind. And in our world today, right, it's not a story about steam shovels and gas versus coal power, right? It's the story of the children of Appalachian immigrants to the Midwest, or black folks who moved to America's cities to work in the industrial Midwest in factory jobs, only to see those jobs cease to exist, or at least be dramatically diminished in today's world. The new part of this story in our world since the 1970s is that the type of change that we've been having in our world has dramatically favored those with formal skills. College graduates, people with technical vocational skills, right, and so on. Part of this shift comes from technological change, like in Mike Mulligan, right? Mike Mulligan's world shift from coal to gasoline power. America's world has switched from manufacturing to investment banking and writing software, right? A tool and die factory in the 1950s would employ a bunch of different people, mostly men, right, on different machines that required a lot of experience and skill that you would gain over time. And right, you could work your way toward a middle-class wage by gaining this experience with just a high school education or perhaps less. Today, a lot of manufacturing in the US is very automated and computer controlled, right? You've got one person who graduated from a technical vocational school who has sufficient training in math and computer coding running these computer automated machines that are doing all of the cutting and such, right? So rather than having a team of high school graduates, you've got that one more highly formally educated person. It's good for him, it's trouble for the folks who are just coming out of high school. Globalization has sort of reinforced this, right? So the dramatic increase in trade and other economic ties across countries has tended to also reinforce this trend. As we import goods that used to be made in the US, the path to the middle class for many Americans a couple of generations ago, whether blue-collar whites in the rural Midwest or black folks in the cities, was this factory job. And in the words of William Julius Wilson, the University of Chicago's sociologist, that work has disappeared. On the other hand, those poised to gain from the increasing importance of skills, most of the people in the room here today, those who are getting a college education, especially from a high-quality school like Hope, right, have prospered. This reality helps explain our current political situation, right? We saw two very popular protest campaigns, one of which is still alive, right? And I would argue that the supporters of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have essentially the same complaint, right? The system is working against them, and that complaint is legitimate, right? They're right. The most common view among economists is that working class folks in the US have lost from increased globalization and technological progress. People then operationalize this anchor in different way, right? You feel the burn and you support a higher minimum wage and you oppose trade, or you decide that you want to make America great again, blow up the current system and move back to some idyllic version of the past. This happens to also be the ending of Mike Mulligan, by the way. Mike and his steam shovel trek back to this sort of idyllic small town where they complete a quest to dig the cellar of the new town hall before the sun goes down. And they're rewarded by Mike being made the new janitor of the town hall, and Marianne gets repurposed as the furnace of the town hall, right? So it's this sort of, they went to the countryside and they were saved by going back to this past where they're still valued for who they are. I'm not going to advocate, as much as I love Mike Mulligan, I'm not going to advocate the moving to the past approach. Better technology and more trade are good things in general. Just to make the point, I think it's possible to be too alarmist about the situation that we're in, and this is one that helps us make sure that we're rooted in what's going on. So this is a picture of real gross domestic product per capita over time, which is a fancy way of saying, imagine you took everything that we produce in the US, or similarly the amount of income that everybody has, and we spread it evenly across every person. How much would each person have if things were actually spread equally? That's what this says. So back, late 70s, early 80s, before inequality really took off, we're at about $25,000, $30,000 a year per person, man, woman, or child. Today, we're closer to $50,000, right? So over the past 40 years, the amount of economic resources we have has doubled. We are richer on average than we used to be. The issue is that the way that we distribute those resources has changed dramatically. Inequality has increased. So trade and globalization and technology are good things that drive us into a future that overall is better, but it creates this polarization at the same time. How do we get the good things without giving up what we gain from it? So I'm personally very concerned about these protest campaigns. I don't sort of agree with the general direction they're going. But it should not be surprising that that a lot of working class Americans want to blow up the system and start over, because it's not working for them. So that's the situation. So let's start talking about hearts and minds. Let's talk about a heartfelt response to inequality. So in my heart of hearts, I'm a baseball fan. Particularly I'm a Cubs fan in the unusual year in which that's actually a good thing, at least so far. Talk to me in October, we'll see if that stays that way. Any baseball fans in the audience? Okay. Any baseball fans in the audience who were born in the 50s? We got a few. There we are. I asked that in particular. So here's a list of baseball players who were born in the early 1950s. Particularly, they were born between 1950 and 1953, played Major League Baseball, but they also have something else in common. Any idea what that might be? Somebody said Hall of Famers. That's correct. Good to see you, Tom. These are all Hall of Fame. These are all Hall of Fame baseball players. Burt Blyleven, George Brett, Goose Gossage, Jim Rice, Bruce Sutter, Dave Winfield. These are guys. This is the full list of people born between 1950 and 1953 who made it to the Baseball Hall of Fame. That's a really short list, right? There are millions of men who are born in that cohort, and these 6 made it to the very top of their profession. It turns out there's another correct answer to this question. This is not just the complete list of men born during that period who made it to the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame. They also have something else in common. You see, men who were born in the US in the early 1950s were part of a peculiar experiment in America's history, the draft lottery for the Vietnam War. At the end of the Vietnam War, the US military began selecting men for military service by randomly drawing their birth dates, essentially out of a hat, and drafting those who were selected earlier in the drawing. And so here's the punchline. None of those men were drafted into the Vietnam conflict. Think about that for a moment. The fate of an entire generation of men was essentially determined by a coin flip, right? The lottery was chosen to be fair. These were a very similar group of men, and they differ only in how they fared on this coin flip. Some got heads, skipped the war, went on to have their faces on plaques in Cooperstown. But there's some other unknown, unheard of group of people out there, just as good at baseball, right? They were drafted, they never reached their potential, didn't end up in the Hall of Fame. They're out there, actually, right? For the most part, they weren't actually fatalities of the war, injured or killed. This is toward the end of the war, and fatalities were relatively slim. Hope College graduate Brennan Mange and I actually have a paper arguing that the reason these guys are missing is because the draft interrupted their baseball training more than anything else. So why talk about baseball? I find it troubling that what happens early on in your life affects the abilities of professional athletes, right? The American dream says that if you work hard, it does not matter where you start, you can make it to the top. It doesn't matter what happens early on. You can always make up for it with effort. And we tend to think of professional sports as the epitome of this meritocracy, right? Imagine what it would be like to have professional sports type scrutiny show up in your profession or in your studies, right? Every time I go to work, a crowd of people watches me, right? Journalists come up at 5 o'clock to me at the end of the day and say, why didn't you do anything useful today, right? A giant billboard outside of my window displays my annual productivity and everybody can see it, right? This is what it's like to be in professional sports. They ruthlessly identify the best and brightest, and we all stand back and are amazed by them. And this is also what the broader market-based economy does really well, right? It identifies those who are best at writing books, starting up new businesses, managing existing businesses, investing capital in all of those things. And it rewards them with a larger chunk of the pie. This is where the top 1% of income earners comes from. But what if the best and brightest became so bright because they happened to win a coin flip? What if that's part of the process? Right, there's a study by another economist, Douglas Frank, who does the same thing with the Vietnam War, and instead of with baseball players, does it with CEOs. People who won the coin flip in the Vietnam draft, who didn't get their number called, are much more likely to become CEOs. They didn't have their lives interrupted by this big thing, and they become CEOs more often. And the problem is that these coin flips are everywhere. There's big ones like, did you get drafted in the military? There are other ones that are smaller that are all over the place. I have a friend who works in education. She tells stories from the schools where kids have some pretty low odds of economic success. Once she worked in a preschool with 2 classrooms directly across the hall from one another. One classroom was for paying students. One was for students who were receiving some subsidies from the government to support their preschool. Right? And these are 4-year-olds. In the one classroom, kids were in line. They were participating, learning to read, learning to play well. You can sort of see, okay, things are going pretty well here. And in the other classroom, there's chaos. It's always noisy, kids aren't listening, nobody's learning. And these are 4-year-olds, right? They haven't done anything to merit differences later on in life, but already you can see the different tracks that they're on. My friend talks about these children and worries that in 15 years, the ones in the second classroom are going to be in trouble, going to be in prison, going to have all of these things going on. We know from research by economist Raj Chetty and others that what kindergarten teacher you have matters. In one study, they flipped coins, they randomly put people in classrooms. The kids who got into the classrooms with better kindergarten teachers earned $320,000 more income than those who got below average teachers. Should be paid more. We know from other research that your economic success depends on your teachers, your school, whether there's another kid in your classroom who happens to be disruptive because his family is having issues, whether your parents got a housing voucher, so on and so forth. All of these things are little coin flips in our lives, and they affect where people end up. These are real children of real parents, and their success depends on coin flips. And these coin flips are hard to eliminate. It's hard to get rid of that aspect of life. So, how does this relate to inequality? For me, a world of coin flips makes the rising inequality that we've been observing that much more concerning. To give you a sense of why I feel this way, think about 2 options. Suppose I give you 2 options. Option A, I flip a coin. If it's heads, I give you $1. If it's tails, you give me $1. Option B, flip the same coin. If it's heads, I give you $1,000. If it's tails, you give me $1,000. If you're like most people, which option you're going to pick? Option A. Now, one good reason to pick option A is because if I flip a coin and I'm up here on stage, you can't ever actually see whether it's heads or tails, right? And so I could cheat, and that might relate to inequality somehow, but that's not my point. My point is that there's a difference in risk between these two, right? Option B is a riskier option. Both of these options have the same average payout, 0. But B is a lot riskier. You might lose $1,000. Economists call this preference for the safer option risk aversion. Everyone else calls it common sense, right? Your everyday dictums, don't gamble with your rent money, diversify your stock portfolio, all of this sort of stuff is based off of that idea. For the students in the crowd, right? Do you want your entire grade for the semester to hang on one multiple choice question? Or do you want it to hang on a broad group of multiple assignments and lots of questions of this sort of thing? You don't want your entire grade to hang on whether you get one question right, because what if you make a mistake? 0 in the course, right? Risk aversion is very natural and reasonable. And it explains one of the big problems with increased inequality. We're putting more and more of our lives into these coin flips. We're increasing the wager. Right? Philosopher John Rawls captures this idea with what people have come to call his veil of ignorance. Imagine you have not yet been born. You don't know which person you're going to become. You have to decide how you're going to set up society, including how much inequality you will allow. Do you want $1 million coin flips? Do you want $1 billion coin flips? Rising inequality makes the coin flip worse by raising the stakes. We're putting more and more weight on the coin flip. The sensible, reasonable person avoids risk, but we're building a society with more risk built into it. So for those of you who would say, yes, I said I was going to make everybody mad, right? So for those of you who say that inequality is increasing, but it's not of a main concern, I would think about this, right? Let's make a coin flip to determine your fate, or maybe the fate of your child, or just somebody that you care about. Right? If it's heads, you become the child of an investment banker. If it's tails, we swap your childhood with that of the typical child born into public housing in Detroit, or make it a small Appalachian town or a village in Malawi or wherever, right? I have a 2-year-old son. I'm not taking that coin flip with my son. And that's not because the people from those places, those sort of downside risk places, aren't good people. I've met many of them and have tremendously benefited from knowing a wide range of people. But the fact that we're unwilling to take that bet should tell us something. That people have no choice but to end with the downside risk of that bet should make us mad, right? Rising inequality is making that bet riskier than it needs to be for those preschool kids. So I've tried to make a broad case for why rising inequality, other things equal as a bad outcome based on sort of common sense and avoiding risk. But we're also at Hope College, and one of the things that I love about Hope College is that it's a place that, Christianity is not the only voice in the discussion, but it has a privileged place in the discussion. So I'm going to return to my evangelical roots here for a moment and quote chapter and verse. I appreciated Karen's introduction in talking about the parable of Lazarus. Let me talk about one other parable that Jesus tells. Matthew 20, Jesus tells a story about workers in a vineyard. I'm going to reset this parable in modern day Holland, if you'll allow me. And he says, this is how the kingdom of heaven works. It's a hot July day. A blueberry farmer, short on help, shows up to the parking lot where day laborers are waiting for work. He hires everyone he can find for one day's work picking blueberries at the going wage. A few hours, the farmer still doesn't have enough help, so he comes back, sees some more day laborers there, and offers to hire them, and gives them a really vague promise. I'll pay you whatever is right. And these workers are saying, it's kind of vague, but I don't have any other options, so okay, I'll work for this guy in this ill-defined offer. This process keeps repeating itself. The farmer keeps on coming back to the parking lot, keeps on hiring day laborers, keeps on promising, I'll give you whatever is right. Finally, he keeps doing this up until 5 p.m. It's 1 hour before quitting time. Hires one last group of workers. At 6 p.m., the farmer calls everybody together and says, okay, it's time to pay wages. And he starts with the last group. He starts with the people who started at 5 p.m. and worked for 1 hour. And he says, here's a full day's wage. Surprise, I will pay you whatever is right. It's starting to sound really good. 1 hour of work for a full day's wage. Right? The workers who came in early and worked 12 long hours are beginning to dream about what they're going to buy with what must be hundreds of dollars coming their direction. When they get to the front of the line, surprise again, they're paid the same. They're paid no more than those who worked 1 hour. They get mad, they object. Surely we can all agree that equal work means unequal pay, but unequal work should mean unequal pay, right? Pay us more, they say. But Jesus says that is not how the kingdom of God works. Our first reaction is often to call this a story about God's grace in a broad spiritual sense. And this is true. We're all sinners. We do not deserve to know and be loved by God. In the beautiful mystery of the Christian faith, we are told by the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Ephesians, "For by grace you have been saved by faith. This is not your own doing." Whether we come early or late to God's family, we're welcomed as full members, full wages, regardless of who we are or what we have done. And this is so incredibly true. What surprises me is that we fail to follow through on the implications of this belief in terms of our economics. And when I say we, I really mean we, including myself. We fail to grasp that a theology of grace removes not only our claim to spiritual superiority, but also our claim to economic superiority. I deserve no more than anyone else, spiritually and materially. The story of the workers is a metaphor with implications beyond what wages these workers get paid, but it's also a story told intentionally in an economic context to undercut the notion that some people, usually including myself, right, I try to include myself in that, deserve greater wealth. We fail to take this idea and do what the Apostle Paul did with it, right? We remember the missionary journeys and the shipwrecks and the imprisonment and all these things, and we forget that much of it occurred while he was traveling around taking a collection up for the poor Jerusalem church. I like to think of the Corinthians letters as his fundraising letters to the wealthy Corinthian church, where he says, "Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard-pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn, their plenty will supply what you need." The goal is equality. So as I said at the beginning of my talk, my hope is that this talk will encourage all of you, my friends, to think and to get mad at me. So to those who do not find inequality alarming, I'm asking you to think again, right? Read the parables in the Synoptic Gospels. Amos, the other prophets, the accounts of Paul's offering collection. Wouldn't they be angry about our current situation? Wouldn't they see what's going on? And wouldn't they agree with the anger of those who working class folks in the U.S. who have become angry about how this system works? Isn't God angry? Okay, so I've spent enough time on one side of this. I'm gonna flip. Hopefully by this point I've convinced you to do something about inequality. I want to raise a second problem, which will probably be more likely to raise issues with a different group of people than the first point. If so far you're with me and you're saying, yeah, then let's do the second part. Many, maybe even most of the ways that you could actually respond to this situation of inequality won't be effective. And they could even make the situation worse. Let's consider one example that's close to my heart. So one dramatic cause and consequence of inequity in our country, both racial and economic, has to do with criminal justice, with the disproportionate incarceration of young black men, particularly those with limited education. As of 2010, the United States locks up more people than anyone else in the world per capita. Right? We lock up more people, larger percentage of our population, than dictators in Russia and Cuba. This is a fact. 1 out of every 6 people in the US is black, but half of our prisoners are black. So this is fundamentally tied up with this inequality we've been talking about. And many people have lamented the diminished tendency of black men to work in market employment. If you just get representative data on the US, it's very clear that between 1980 and 2000, right, the percentage of black men with less than high school education who are employed or in school has fallen dramatically. But this is easy to explain because the number who are institutionalized, who are in prison, has also increased dramatically. You can't work in the market if you're in prison. If you're not familiar with these facts, I'd encourage you, go read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, or something similar, and be prepared to be mad. And so we feel this call to do something. I feel this myself. When I was in graduate school, I spent a lot of time hanging around a nonprofit church-related employment agency. And this place basically helped anybody who wanted a job to help get a job. And so folks who had a lot of difficulty would come through the door. Half of their clients had criminal records relevant to their job search. And so I would help these clients, many of whom had limited computer skills, just do online applications and things like that. And you learn a lot about folks from filling out online applications, right? You sit down with somebody and fill out their job application, you learn a lot. I met a guy who'd been in prison for years, who in prison had risen to be the supervisor of a team of people who were repairing military vehicles. This guy was managing a team doing that, had been doing it for years, and then came out and was all of a sudden applying for jobs at Burger King, because that's what he could do. That's what jobs and people might consider him for. I made a resume that legitimately included as a skill, judo champion of Africa. I met a guy who had been the judo champion of Africa, which was pretty cool. And I met another guy who walked 6 miles in the rain to our appointment for me to make a resume for him because he had a child on the way, and he was going to support that child. Near the end of these online applications, you get the screen of doom, and I'm not talking about the blue screen of death that the students may not be as familiar with, but those of us from earlier time are more familiar with. I'm talking about this screen that we've all seen on job applications, and if you're like me, you probably just whiz right past it. You probably just whiz right past it. Right, it's the part that asks, have you ever been convicted or pleaded guilty or nolo contendere to a felony? And you could just see the countenance of the people in front of me, their eyes drop. This is a waste of time. There was one man who I still remember who was bold enough to confront the absurdity of this 20-something white kid asking him about his criminal record, right? Are these people really going to give me a job? This is a waste of time. So all of this seems to have an easy solution, right? We have moral outrage, and so we say, let's get rid of this thing. Let's ban the box there that you have to check that says, I have a criminal record. And many cities have done this, New York City and others. And the emotional appeal is almost irresistible, especially for a Christian. We believe in redemption, but instead we live in a society where one error, right, not quite a coin flip, but one error of youth or often related to addiction affects you for the rest of your life. So let's remove the scar, ban the box. Here's the trouble. Banning the box may actually harm black men, on average. I find this really troubling. So Amanda Agan from Princeton University, Sonia Starr from the University of Michigan ran a study of employment. They sent fictional applications to jobs in New York and New Jersey. On these applications, they include names that clearly signal race. So you've got Jamal for a black man, Greg for a white man, so on and so forth. And employers tend to respond more positively to the one with the white name. This is a well-known fact that's been duplicated in lots of studies, including ones that I ran with students here at Hope College. In their study, employers call back the white name 7% more often than the black names. Here's the surprise. Halfway through Agan and Starr's study, New York enacted its ban the box law. They got rid of this from the job application. Racial discrimination jumped from 7% to 45%. What? This study's new. There are a lot of questions left to answer. There's some other studies that give conflicting results, and so I'm not going to say this is the final word on this, but this is a scary situation. We have this righteous anger about a system that's broken. We have something that we think is going to help, and the possible conclusion is that we may be increasing racial discrimination in employment. I would find this incredibly disheartening, both because of the stakes and because we could have predicted and avoided this. You see, economists have a well-documented theory called statistical discrimination. It boils down to a simple idea, right? If employers are trying to avoid applicants with some characteristic, say criminal records, and you take away information on that attribute, employers are going to try to fill that information gap. They still have the same goals. And so what do you do if you're the employer? You start avoiding some group of people that has a disproportionate number of people within it who have a criminal record. What group has a disproportionate number of people with criminal records? Young, low education, black men. So that's what Egan and Starr are arguing is going on in their study, right? You pass this ban-the-box law, and employers respond by discriminating on some other dimension, race, more. Economists have talked about statistical discrimination for 40 years. It's a concern that people knew about going in ahead of time. Michelle Alexander actually talks about it in her book. And if we had experimented earlier on, tried this thing out carefully, we would have a better sense of whether these unintended consequences were going to derail everything. But on we've plowed instead, and we're possibly actually exacerbating racial inequity in our wake. Strangely, we have, as a society, have never really developed a Hippocratic oath for economic policy. All right, as you probably know, doctors of medicine take an oath to do no harm. And this influences a lot about the health care you receive, right? I had to go to the doctor a little while ago to get some medicine for my son, and I can trust that that medicine, no matter how bad tasting and no matter how much he doesn't want to take it, is not going to harm him because I know it's been tested, right? There are clinical trials where first they have to demonstrate that this is not going to harm the patient, and then there's a second stage trial where they have to actually prove that this thing is effective compared to a placebo or whatever other best practices out there. And the medical system and our regulations for testing drugs are not perfect, right? There's lots of imperfections there. But our approach to inequality and poverty rarely comes close to what we're used to in medicine. The official trial registry in medicine, clinicaltrials.gov, says that there's 99 interventional studies of acetaminophen, which you probably know as Tylenol, right? We know so much more about the effectiveness and safety of Tylenol than we do about almost any economic policy. Let's move, again, closer to the topic of inequality. Back to that topic. The minimum wage is often a topic that people bring up in this discussion. And we've been experimenting on people, not intentionally, but sort of unintentionally along the way with the minimum wage for years. Increasing the minimum wage to $15 is often a common goal of people who agree with me that inequality is extremely concerning and a moral priority of our time. Cities across the country, Seattle, Los Angeles, others have passed laws increasing the minimum wage significantly. Right? And $15 an hour minimum wage sounds great, right? 15 hours, about 2,000 hours a year for full time, that's like $30,000 job. We say if we could get everybody a job at $30,000 a year, that would be incredible progress. But I hope you're asking the Hippocratic question. Could we be doing harm? It turns out there's at least two possible stories about the minimum wage. All right. One is a dystopia world. Think like the world of It's a Wonderful Life, if you've seen the movie, right? There's Mr. Potter who owns absolutely everything. There's some person who owns everything, sets all the wages, decides who to hire, has all of this power, and rigs the system to pay workers just barely enough so that they can survive and be healthy enough to work for him. In this world, what the workers need is power, right? They need a union or a revolution or a strong government that forces a higher minimum wage. But there's another possible world, one that's popular in introductory economics courses, right? In intro econ world, people are paid according to their productivity. Workers can shop their services around to multiple possible employers. Employers have to pay people according to the value of their work, because if they don't, then the employer is going to, or the worker is going to shop around their services, right? They're going to find someone else who will pay them more. So employers are paying people according to what they produce, the market value of what they make. And employers can't afford to pay people more. If they pay people more than that, then they're going to be unprofitable, they're going to go out of business. So in this second world, the minimum wage is actually going to break the Hippocratic oath, right? Employers are paying their workers as much as possible. You force them to pay them a bit more. They're not going to do that. Instead, they're going to let the workers go. In an attempt to raise workers' wages, we take away their jobs. Again, these are two possible options. Either one of them or something in between could be true. So let's look at how we've been experimenting. Let's try to find out. We haven't run a medical trial with the minimum wage. That would be hard, right? We haven't given 25 states the real $15 minimum wage and 25 states the sugar pill placebo version of the minimum wage, right? That's hard to do. But we can do something similar, right? Seattle raised its minimum wage to $15 a little while ago, and a lot of communities around Seattle didn't. So we can go and look, see what happened to these places. Actually look at the evidence and say, not start with which story we think is the correct one, but look to see which one
actually seems to play out in our world by comparing Seattle to other communities around it that didn't raise its minimum wage. Lucky for us, economists Jacob Victor and a team at the University of Washington, they happen to be in Seattle, said, hey, is this thing doing good or is it doing harm? Here's the good. So far, and this is still early on, right? There's a lot going on in Seattle, but the minimum wage hike increased wage rates of low-wage workers in Seattle by about 73 cents per hour, beyond what would have happened if they hadn't changed the minimum wage. The bad, some workers did lose jobs and hours. You compute it all out, they get about 19 minutes per week. And so the bottom line, when you add it all up, right, workers are getting paid higher wages, they're working fewer hours. Is this good for them overall? Low-wage workers in Seattle are currently making about $300 more per year than what they would have made if they hadn't increased the minimum wage. $300 is not nothing, right? It's something. It's about on par with about what a month of food stamps is, right? Except it's in your paycheck with your work that you were able to get with your own effort, right? And it's positive, right? It's getting some benefits to workers from the minimum wage is certainly better than what some people might expect coming out of a first economics course. But in a world where the share of income going to the top 1% has doubled, I find $300 fairly unimpressive. And the effects they found in Seattle are pretty similar to what people find in other contexts. And so the minimum wage, which has become this target of, right, people who have what I think to be good and righteous anger about problems with how things are working and then latch on to, if only we could increase the minimum wage to $15, things would be solved. I don't see it when we use our brains and we look at the evidence. I'm personally mildly in favor of modest, careful increases in the minimum wage. I'm actually not opposed to it. But if we use our brains and follow the evidence, I think we have to look other places to think about how to solve inequality. So, hopefully I've made those who agree with me that inequality is extremely important frustrated by this point, right? Because I've given you a couple examples of places where we're trying to do something good and we either do something counterproductive or we do something that's not particularly helpful. Good. We're in a frustrating situation. Inequality has increased dramatically. That fact should generate some combination of concern, sadness, and anger. But the actions we take, the policies we promote, don't actually always help. So how do we do something that actually is good? How do we productively move forward from this? Right, this is Critical Issue Symposium, not just economic inequality, but economic inequality in a democratic society. How do we gauge inequality in a democratic society when engaging productively is difficult? It's not automatic. Simply caring is not enough. Let me give a couple of examples that I've seen of how this has been successful. Return to criminal justice for a moment. So a project called Reading for Life in my new home of South Bend works with juvenile offenders. And there's lots of programs like this around the country, right? Rather than having teens pick up trash along the highway, the program pairs young offenders with a mentor and they read interesting books together, Harry Potter. And they discuss the role of different classical virtues in the literature. So you have a participant who gets some combination of reading, mentoring, and thinking about what a virtuous life looks like. And the program was popular. They couldn't get everybody into it who wanted to be into it, so they actually started holding lotteries for spots in this program at the Juvenile Justice Center in St. Joe County, where South Bend is. And aside from being a fair way to decide who gets this program, the lottery created the social science equivalent of a medical trial, right? Some of my colleagues at the Lab for Economic Opportunities, I was not involved in this study, but some of my colleagues at Notre Dame teamed up with Reading for Life to actually follow up with these teens later on in life, right? Does this program work? Are they better off than if they'd been picking up trash along the road? Turns out they are. The kids who won that lottery and got the Reading for Life program are 38% less likely to be arrested. That's huge. That's an incredible difference in the likelihood that these kids are going to return to crime. The kids from Reading for Life are now in their 20s, and we're trying to figure out whether this program also helped them finish high school and go to college. Stay tuned on that. But I love the Reading for Life example because it gives us an example of how you can engage both your heart and your brain, right? This program absolutely required a heartfelt response of people who looked at the criminal justice system and said, this needs to be better. We're doing so much harm here. And they came up with a creative program to address that need. And then they took it to the next step, right, of being willing to subject their passion, the thing that they had poured their lives into, to a bunch of number crunchers to see whether it was meeting the goals that they had hoped it would meet. From earlier, I talked about how inequality feeds on the gap in skills, right? We know of interventions that are effective in closing skill gaps between kids born to different families. A good Michigan example is the Perry Preschool Project, which is a famous one that was run in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Right? It provided very high quality preschool and family support to high-risk kids. Preschool. Again, those kids in the 2 different classrooms. What if we gave incredibly high quality preschool to kids from high-risk families? Turns out it helps a lot. Right? They follow the kids who got into this school and some other kids who were not able to get into the school. The ones who got high-quality preschool, they earn more money now, they use less welfare, and probably most importantly, they commit a lot fewer crimes. They're a lot less likely to get caught up in the criminal justice system. We know that some charter schools, like Harlem Children's Zone and KIPP, right, they pour an incredible amount of time and resources into kids at the elementary and secondary level. And they expect those kids from difficult backgrounds to perform as well as other kids. They're forced by law to use a lottery to decide who gets into the class and who doesn't. And so again, they have this sort of medical trial, and they can demonstrate that the kids who get into some of these schools catch up to their better endowed peers from across town. Right? It's amazing how you can see with the Harlem Children's Zone kids, they literally, these kids from incredibly challenging backgrounds, literally catch up to the average white kid in New York City. It's amazing. They overcome the coin flips that they had earlier on. Right? Passionate and creative responses to educational needs, plus an openness to actually looking to see whether this thing works or not, allows us to expand the things that do work. Those are sort of nonprofit, small-level grassroots thing. We can also do this with government policy. Right? As I mentioned before, right, in the mid-1990s, people, William Julius Wilson, others, were becoming very concerned that this blue-collared factory work was disappearing in U.S. inner cities. The U.S. government ran, I just realized I wanted to have a slide here. See, Reading for Life, Harlem Children's Zone. Okay, the Moving to Opportunity demonstration is something that the federal government actually ran. They recognized this problem. They said, let's test out something to see if it works. This sounds kind of strange to us now, right? We don't sort of expect the government to run big scientific projects. They actually did this thing. They offered public housing residents a chance to enter a lottery that if they won, they'd get a voucher they could use to move to a neighborhood where they could actually a better neighborhood where they could rent an apartment or house. Sadly, 10 to 15 years later, the program actually didn't pay off the way it was expected. The goal was to help the adults in these families get jobs in different neighborhoods, put them in places where work hadn't disappeared. But the funny thing is that while MDO didn't work as planned, it actually ended up working. It's a few years later now. It's been 20 years since they started this thing off. And they followed up with these folks who got housing vouchers to move into apartments out of public housing complexes versus the folks who had to stay in the public housing complex. And the kids of those people look a lot different. We couldn't fix it with the parents with MTO, but MTO provided a big difference in terms of how the kids are doing. Growing up in a different neighborhood made a big difference. And that's what the parents actually said. They said, the reason I wanted to move is I wanted to get my kid away from the drugs and crime that they were experiencing in public housing. And the kids are doing better. So, we can address inequality with our hearts and our brains, right? We have examples, right? We have so many examples where people cared enough to do something and not stop there. They took the next step to actually pay attention to whether it does. I was really encouraged talking to some of the folks that were in the next session after this one, which I hope lots of folks go to, about some of the organizations here in Holland and how they pay attention to whether what they're doing is working or not. I'm fortunate to see this in my job all over the place, right? Lab for Economic Opportunities, I'm working with folks from Catholic Charities, county, city governments all the time who care enough to act and they think enough to consider what they're doing is actually working. So, how can you respond? What are things that you can do going forward from this? If you buy my argument that we need to care about this in terms of both our hearts and our minds. Part of this is about politics, right? It is about democracy. You need to be bothered enough to care, to do something. For the students out there, there is an election, not just a presidential election, local and state elections coming up very soon. Are you registered to vote? Deadlines for that have to be very close, right? Are you registered to vote? Are you paying attention to whether candidates prioritize issues of economic equity? Again, not just at the presidential level, but at the state and local levels. Do you demand leaders who embrace evidence, who embrace complication and nuance, who don't give simple responses to things that are going to be difficult problems to tackle? Right? The MTO experiment is still, sadly, a rarity. Start demanding leaders who treat their experimentation on you and on the poor the same way we do experimentation with pharmaceuticals. Try it out before you prescribe it to me. And this extends to our engagement with nonprofit organizations, work and volunteering and giving. Right? Look past the shiny brochure, the anecdote of one person. Look past the website that tells you what fraction of their budget went to overhead. Because you don't care about how much money they spend, you care about how much of a difference they're making, right? Is this organization oriented toward really creating difference for the people that it's serving? Give to organizations that have demonstrated that their programs actually reach their goals, right? The Reading for Life example I gave, that's a real organization that needs real funding, right? Not all organizations are going to do this sort of rigorous academic medical trial sort of thing that I just talked about with some of these examples. That's not possible for all organizations. It's actually possible for a lot more than probably think that it can be. There's partners like the one I work with who are glad to help people with those services. But even those that can't should demonstrate a willingness to admit when they have made mistakes and continually change in response, right? Give to organizations that demonstrate impact, and at least track down organizations that show some willingness to question what they do and make it better. There's a lot more detail I could go into if we had incredible time, huge amounts of time. We don't, so I'm not going to go into more now. I'll talk more in the focus session later on today about sort of practical steps. But what I want to leave you with is to remind us that we live in a world that's become more economically polarized than at any point in time than even my grandparents' lifetime, right? We've increased the gap between the rich and poor. We've taken those coin flips that inevitably happen, and we've increased the amount that we're wagering. We've moved away from a biblical vision that, at the deepest level, none of us deserves any more than any other, spiritually or materially. It's all a gift from God, who loves all people. We should be alarmed by this situation. So alarmed that we respond not in simple, trite ways, right? Giving a few dollars to the first charity that comes to mind, supporting a political movement that's only aspect is anger at the status quo. We need to take it to another level, right? The alarm of our hearts at rising inequality should also drive us to engage our brains, right? And that by engaging both our hearts and brains, devoting our attention to the hard work of figuring out what is actually going to work to generate equity. Thank you so much for inviting me to come. Thank you for your time.
Thank you to each of you for coming. Thanks to David for that remarkable address. Please take advantage of the terrific opportunities for learning the rest of the day. David will be back here at 1 o'clock this afternoon if you want to engage in more questions. Again, thank you and have a really good day.